Okay, today is December 11th. It's 3 p.m. So it's time for Summa Theologica. We're going to continue what we started last week and try to move a little more quickly week by week, since we're going to get past like the structure and getting used to the format and all that kind of stuff, and be able to focus more and more on the content. So we'll move slowly for a couple weeks, and then it'll just get really simple. But remember what I said last week. Once you get the hang of the structure, and that's no longer a distraction, you can just start using the Summa as a reference. And I shared with you last week. Let me just do this again real quick. Give me 1 second. I shared with you this link. Talk about nerdy. This is an example of nerdiness. I shared with you this link where I've got the entire Summa available on one web page in a simple nerdy text file that you can search with your keyboard just by hitting Control F. So you can search for anything. Any topic that comes up, you can just search for it. Like if you want to know about, let's say, the Immaculate Conception. One of you mentioned before, did St. Thomas ever say anything about the Immaculate Conception? And the answer is no, he never did. Maybe he did. Let's see. Yeah, that's an editorial note, so that don't count. That's a note, that don't count. These are just all notes. So Thomas Aquinas didn't mention that because it wasn't established at that time in the church. But if we take something like original sin, talked about that in scripture class today. If we take original sin, we'll find that phrase 381 times in the Summa, and you can just bounce through the Summa and check it out. So there's two different things we're trying to do here when we study the Summa. First of all, we're trying to learn the content of the Summa by just reading through it one article at a time. But secondly, we're trying to learn, not trying, we're starting to learn to use the Summa as a reference book for any topics that you have questions about, any controversial topics. You can always just go search the Summa and find out what St. Thomas said about it. All right, so two goals of this course: to become familiar with the content and structure of the Summa, and to, secondly, just start using it. Use it as a reference book, okay? Last class, we got introduced to the Summa, and we started question 1, and we studied article 1. We went through it nice and slow, went through all the comprehension questions that you need to answer for the assignments, real simple, went through article number 1. We discussed whether, besides philosophy, any further doctrine is required. And St. Thomas's answer to that question, let me turn the chat back on. What was St. Thomas's answer to that question? Besides philosophy, is any further doctrine necessary? Is any further doctrine or any other science necessary besides philosophy? He said yes. Good. Okay. Who can tell me why is another doctrine necessary? Why is another doctrine necessary or required? Make it brief. Just think and then try to write an answer as briefly as possible. Why would another doctrine be required? Because we can satisfy. No, that's the wrong answer. That's can't. Okay, yeah. I was gonna say you just completely missed it. Yeah, that's right. That's actually right, George. Because human reason couldn't discover some of the things that God has to reveal. Very good. Okay. So in the first article, we looked at that question, whether we need anything besides philosophy in order to fulfill our purpose, right? In order to accomplish the end for which we were created. And the answer is yes, because the end of our life is actually God himself. And we simply can't know what's necessary to know about God without his help. So philosophy won't bring us far enough. We need God to actually reach down to us and teach us what needs to be known to be saved. All right, good. Can I send that link? You mean the link to that document I just shared? It's real simple to remember. That the one you're talking about, the link to that whole page? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so that's the whole Summa just in one page. And like what I said is it's what's helpful about it is the whole Summa is there on that one page, and you can just hit Control F on your keyboard and search for any word or phrase you want, and then just kind of scroll through the Summa and see what St. Thomas has to say about it. All right. So last week we looked at Article 1. This week we're going to get into Article 2. So let's just get right into it, okay? And not waste much time here. The second article that St. Thomas investigates is whether sacred doctrine is actually a science, whether theology is actually a science. And what do we mean by science? What does he mean by science? What is a science? Who can describe a science in like Aristotelian, Thomistic? Thomistic refers to St. Thomas. What is a science? What does that mean? Systematic form of knowledge. Yeah, that's good. Study of an art. Kind of, sort of. Systematic is a key word. Systematic knowledge of the real principles and causes and elements of a subject. Okay, so real thorough knowledge, mastery of a subject. When he asks, is sacred doctrine a science? What that means is sacred doctrine something that we can study like a science? Can we gain scientific knowledge of it? Or is it something that, let's say, God needs to reveal to someone? Is it like a mystery that needs to be revealed? In the early church, there are still many people today who think that the only way you can learn truth about God is for God to like sprinkle magic fairy dust on you and like all of a sudden cause you to know things, like the scarecrow in Wizard of Oz, when he just suddenly starts rattling off the Pythagorean theorem. Some people think that's what religious knowledge is like there's no way to actually study it or go work for it. You just have to get lucky and God randomly gives it to people. People talk about vocations today in the same way, like, we're just waiting for God to, appear to us and tell us to do something. But the question is sacred doctrine like that? Is it just random? Like God just, gives it to people like how he gave wisdom to Solomon? Is that how it works? Is that how it actually works? Or is it scientific? Can we actually go study it and get it? So that's the second question here. So is sacred doctrine a science? Is it something that all of us can go study and learn and master? Or will only the chosen few who God gives it to magically actually have it? So let's look at what he has to say. Whether sacred doctrine is a science. The first objection, remember, this is a wrong answer. Okay, so the first objection is it seems that sacred doctrine is not science. And I mentioned last week that, or 2 weeks ago, whenever it was, I mentioned that one way you can learn St. Thomas's answer is to read the objections and realize that his answer is the opposite of them. So we read here that it seems that sacred doctrine is not science. Well, then obviously the truth must be that it is science. Okay, so that's another easy way to find St. Thomas's answer. It seems that it's not science, the objection says, because every science proceeds from self-evident principles. But sacred doctrine proceeds from the articles of faith, which are not self-evident, since their truth is not admitted by all men. For all men have not faith. And that's a quote from sacred scripture. So if all men do not have faith, then all men cannot claim that the teachings of the church are self-evident. And if the teachings of the church are not self-evident, then sacred doctrine cannot be a science. So that's argument number one. Pretty good argument based on sacred scripture. Pretty good argument. Objection 2, no science deals with individual facts. But this sacred science treats of individual facts, such as the deeds of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Therefore, sacred doctrine is not a science. So we've got 2 good objections, 2 good arguments that sacred doctrine is not a science. First of all, that the principles of it are not self-evident, but they have to be received by faith, and not all men have faith. So that's the first argument. And then secondly, sciences don't deal with individual details of individual people and so on. They're general, they're universal. And yet sacred science deals with the details of the life of Abraham. And by sacred science, he means divine revelation. We learn about the details of the life of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. That's not science, that's just history, right? So two good arguments that it's not a science. But then St. Thomas raises this contradiction to cast doubt, right? To make us second guess what appears to be good answers. They appear to be pretty good, but now St. Thomas introduces this line from St. Augustine, which appears to contradict those objections. Augustine says, to this science alone belongs that whereby saving faith is begotten, nourished, protected, and strengthened. So St. Thomas argues, first of all, that St. Augustine refers to this as a science. And second, what he's describing can be said of no science except sacred doctrine. Therefore, sacred doctrine is a science. So there's St. Thomas's answer to the question. He introduces a contradiction from an authoritative source. The authoritative source is St. Augustine. Now, you can see that that's not a very good argument. That's not a very good argument for someone who's not a Catholic, right? Or not a Christian, because someone who's not a Christian wouldn't care what some guy named St. Augustine has to say. A Protestant might say that they don't care what St. Augustine has to say because St. Augustine's not in the Bible. So it's clear that St. Thomas is trying to argue here with Catholic people who would take St. Augustine to be an authority. It wouldn't be a good argument to use with someone who didn't care what St. Augustine says. So there's reason to doubt these objections. And now St. Thomas gets into his answer here. I answer that sacred doctrine is a science. And just for anyone who thinks the Summa Theologica is different to study, that's how easy it is to study the Summa Theologica. St. Thomas says, I answer that sacred doctrine is a science. You don't have to be a genius to learn the answer to the question. St. Thomas says it in black and white, as simple as can be. Sacred doctrine is a science. And then he goes on to explain how it's a science, and he's going to address the objections when he does this. He says, first of all, we must bear in mind that there are two different kinds of sciences. Two different kinds of sciences. There are some which proceed from a principle known by the light of natural intelligence, that is, they're self-evident. Some sciences, the knowledge is built from the beginning only on things that are obvious to everyone. And he gives two examples, arithmetic and geometry. So for those of you who have messed around or studied with geometry, classical geometry, where does the study of classical geometry start? How do we start the study of classical geometry? And I'm not talking about modern high school geometry. I'm talking about classical geometry. How does classical geometry start? No, if we start classical geometry, how does the study begin? Okay, Gianna, you're getting there, right? Good, Josh. That's one. There's three things. Definitions is one of them. What else is there? Two other things. Anybody else? Very good. Almost, not propositions, postulates. So geometry starts with axioms, definitions, and postulates. And I'll write it here, so everybody sees this word, postulates. Okay, so the study of geometry starts with axioms, definitions, and postulates. And the reason why they're important is because they're easy for everyone to understand. An axiom is a self-evident truth. No one questions the truth of an axiom. An example of an axiom would be something like a whole is greater than any of its parts. Right? That would be an axiom. There's no one who can deny that that's false. Everyone can see that that's true. And so a science like geometry begins with truths like that and then uses them to draw conclusions about other things. All right. A whole is equal to all of its parts. Yeah. So there's depending on what geometry book you read, there's anywhere from like 5 to like 12 axioms, okay? Universal truths, or if two different things are both equal to another thing, then they must be equal to themselves, right? That equal to each other. That'd be another axiom. So geometry starts with axioms. Everyone can agree that those things are true, and therefore, if we can use them to prove something, everyone will agree that that thing is true also. So we can build science starting from self-evident truths, okay? And we can be confident that they're true, okay? So arithmetic and geometry are examples of sciences that proceed from a principle known by the light of natural intelligence, okay? Self-evident truths. And then secondly, St. Thomas says there are some sciences which proceed from principles known by the light of a higher or first science. So some sciences are not self-evident. They're not based on self-evident truths, but they're accepted by people who have already studied other sciences, okay? So for example, he says the science of perspective proceeds from principles that are established by geometry. And the science of music proceeds from principles that are established by arithmetic. So there's two different kinds of sciences. One science, which is considered like a primary science, is based on absolute truths which are self-evident. There are other sciences that are considered like secondary sciences that can be accepted by people who have already learned and have been persuaded of the primary sciences. So two different kinds of sciences. That's where St. Thomas begins his answer. So first of all, understand that there's two, yeah, that's right, George, like a hierarchy of sciences. Yep. Okay, so there's two different kinds of sciences, some which are drawn directly from self-evident truths, some which are built upon sciences that have been drawn from self-evident truths, okay? And he gives us two examples. And then he says, so it is that sacred doctrine is a science because it proceeds from principles established by the light of a higher science. So he says sacred doctrine is not a science like arithmetic and geometry. It's more like a science like music because it's established by the light of some higher science, namely, and this is very confusing, the science of God and the blessed, the knowledge of God. Hence, just as the musician accepts on authority the principles taught by the mathematician, so sacred science is established on principles revealed by God. So this is kind of like a tricky answer that he gives, in my opinion, because he says, well, if we take a music class, the teacher will be a mathematician. And he's talking about classical music, not like instrumental music or choir class. See, if we take a classical music class, the teacher will be a mathematician. And sometimes as we learn the science of music, he'll make statements that we have to accept. And we accept them because he's a mathematician. He's an expert in the subject. And we trust that the principle that he mentions is true and that he could prove it if we needed him to prove it. We accept it because he's a mathematician. And so we build our knowledge of the science based on the assumption of the truth of things taught to us by a mathematician. And in the same way, because sacred doctrine or sacred science is taught to us by God himself through revelation, we receive it trusting in the teacher. We trust the teacher. The teacher is God himself. So in divine revelation, just like the music student would learn from the math teacher, the theology student learns from God himself, who tells us how things are, and we accept that. Can he prove, George asks, can he prove that sacred scripture is established on principles revealed by God? That's a good question. Well, the first thing is that, first of all, we have human authors, right? We have human authors that write the sacred scriptures. And you could say, like most people do today, you could say, well, how do we know they're not just making it up, right? How do we know that Moses wasn't just some clever guy, that had a good education, and he, decided that he was just going to write the 5 books of Moses and become famous? Well, the problem with, that sounds smart at first glance, right? But if we just think through that, it really makes no sense. So Moses was just some guy that was educated in Egypt, decided to write a book. And the book that he wrote about tells the story of how he led the Hebrews out of Egyptian captivity through the Red Sea, how he received the commandments from God on Mount Sinai, how he performed miracles, how he turned a staff into a serpent, how he healed a leprous hand, all these stories that he tells. And he chose to write all these stories about miracles he did, enormous historical events that took place. And then in the end, he actually somehow ended up with symbols of these things that remained, that could be shown, like the staff and the manna and stuff like that. That's an impressive accomplishment, is it? I mean, talk about a book. Not only did I write this book, but I even have some manna in a jar, and I've got this rod that I used, and I've got these other things. So that's pretty impressive. Oh, by the way, I also somehow led these Hebrew people to possess the land of Canaan, which, just a coincidence that happens to be the story I told. So you just see that there would be no way to explain. It's not like he just it's not like he wrote Lord of the Rings and just told some story about, Middle Earth from some past generation. The events that he told were all present and visible, for anyone who reads the book. To this day, we still have Israel in the land of Canaan, and there's no one who can explain how in the world it got there or why it continues to persevere there, unless the things that Moses wrote are true. So there's signs that give evidence to these things that make them appear to be true. Okay. Well, George, you're the one making claims now. Is that a scientific statement you're making, George? That there were multiple writers who didn't know each other but wrote of the same things? Is that a scientific statement that you're ready to present hard evidence to prove to us, or is that just something you found in your pocket this morning? What is that there? You have evidence. You have evidence that there were multiple writers who put together the 5 books of Moses that Jesus said Moses wrote. So, Jesus doesn't understand who wrote those books. The Old Testament writers didn't know each other. How is that another scientific statement, George? How would you demonstrate the lack of knowledge possessed by Old Testament writers? How would you demonstrate that someone doesn't know someone else? How would that proof go? I meant the whole Old Testament. So the whole Old Testament was written by different people. That's obviously true, right? That's why the books are ascribed to different people, like the prophecy of Isaiah and the Psalms of David and the Proverbs of Solomon. So that's not like some secret, right? That there are different authors of the scriptures. But your argument that they didn't know each other, I'm pretty confident that David knew Moses. You mean that they didn't live together? I don't know why living together would be necessary to write a book that's true. No, we're not debating. George is just saying some things. There's no debate. So you see, George, you're making some scientific statements, and I don't see any science. So that's part of the problem. Okay. But anyway, let's get back to the topic. We can take that up later and get back into that. But let's finish through here. All right. So St. Thomas's argument is that divine revelation is a science that's presented to us And it's presented to us on the authority of the teacher, who is God, who we would expect would know these things. So it's not a science like arithmetic and geometry. It's more like a science like music. And of course, we know that because we tell people it's to be received by faith. We don't pretend it's scientific. We don't pretend we have hard evidence for these things. No one even claims that, because that would make no sense. We tell everyone it's not based on some kind of reproducible evidence. It's based on God's own testimony. And then when you ask, well, how do we know that God actually revealed these things? Well, in Moses's case, Moses said, this was his testimony. He was the only one present. He was watching the sheep of his father-in-law, and he saw a burning bush, and out of the bush, he heard a voice speaking to him. And the bush said that he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he revealed the things to Moses. No one was there to confirm that story, so we either accept it or reject it. We either accept it, or we accuse Moses of being a liar. Now, if you're going to accuse Moses of being a liar, what would be your evidence to prove that Moses was lying? What would be your evidence to prove that Moses was lying? You would say, well, I've never seen a burning bush before. Well, that's not very good evidence, because there's lots of stuff you've never seen before, right? That doesn't mean it's all false, or anyone who claims to have seen it is lying, right? So if Moses claims that he was present and he heard a voice and the voice said these things to him, we would have no scientific grounds for calling him a liar. We'd have no way to prove him false. So, you would be calling him false by faith and not by any kind of scientific knowledge. So one person can choose to accept his testimony by faith, and then you've got the smart aleck who says, no, there's no evidence, but he says that by faith also. So it's just a question of, what assumption are you going to make? That this man Moses was lying about being spoken to while he was in the wilderness watching some sheep? Or you're going to assume that he was lying about that, or that he was actually telling the truth, okay? Well, it's also that the bush was not consumed by the fire, so it was miraculous, and so on. So again, rejecting, this is what I want you to make sure you understand this, because you get all these like smart aleck responses from people who actually don't think about what they're saying. If Moses is accused of lying, wouldn't he be innocent until proven guilty? So we would assume that he's not lying unless he's proven guilty. Now, we might say, well, maybe he has a history of telling lies. Okay, well, show us, where is the history of Moses telling lies? Well, there is no such history of Moses. So there really is no reasonable grounds to accuse him of lying. And so to take that position would be the unreasonable position. And, maybe he's crazy. So you're going to accuse him of being crazy. Would that be a scientific diagnosis of some kind of real problem? And how would you diagnose, some kind of mental problem of a man who lived 3,400 years ago? Because you simply don't like what he said, so he must be crazy. I think that would be a hard argument to make, all right? But so we see that we already know that divine revelation is based on faith, no duh, but that's part of the whole point. There's no way that we could ever know what God would know. And if we just reason about it and say, if there was a God, let's just assume, if there was a God, would he know about things that we didn't know about? If there was a God, you can answer this. If there was a God who created the world, who is eternal and infinite, would he know things that we don't know? The answer would obviously be yes. Now, some smart aleck could say, no, but that's just being foolish. So The reasonable person would actually answer that question and say, yes, if there was a God, he would know things that we don't know, right? So if he told us things, would it be possible that he would tell us things that we didn't know and that we could not prove? And the answer would be yes. So when we quote unquote believe in God, we're not acting unreasonably. It's perfectly reasonable to say that we believe that there is a God. There are reasons to believe that, unless, of course, you're one of these evolutionists who believes the whole universe, including human nature, just sort of randomly assembled by chance out of, who knows what. If you think that's reasonable, if you think that's more reasonable than an intelligent, infinite, powerful creator made things, but then you can choose to be the atheist who believes in chance. And one thing about those atheists, they're the people who are yelling at us that if we don't control the world, it's going to blow up because we have to keep everything under control because everything is prone towards destruction. The same people who tell us the whole world came from chance, out of nothing and turned into this amazing, beautiful, balanced create. They're the same ones telling us that if we use too much hairspray, the sun is going to explode, right? Same people. So you can see this self-contradiction is always a sign that something's wrong. Okay. If the universe evolved out of chance, I think it's pretty safe to say it's going to be okay, right? We're probably not going to ruin it. The cows are not going to ruin it. It's probably going to be all right. If it came to this point by itself, I think it's good. But what I want you to see is that acknowledging that if there was a God, he would know things that we would not know. He would have access to knowledge that we do not have. We would not be able to verify his claims scientifically, and therefore faith is actually reasonable, and that denying faith is actually not reasonable. We see that this attempt to try to make religion seem stupid really doesn't make any sense. It actually is more reasonable. So, and if anybody says they never accept anything by faith, that's also ridiculous, because if you're in the house and you tell someone, that it's raining outside and they grab an umbrella and they haven't actually gone and checked for themselves, they've just made a decision in their life by faith. And we do that 24 hours a day, all the time. When you wake up in the morning and you step out of your bed, you put your foot down expecting a floor to be there by faith. You're not scientifically certain that the floor is going to actually be there. You put your foot down and stand up by faith. Everything, so much of what we do is done by faith constantly. When people object to faith, what they say doesn't even make any sense. So we do things by faith all the time. Yeah. Well, yeah, the bunk bed, that'd be an even better lesson, right? But you see, we live by faith all the time. Like when you go into your car, turn the key in the car, you assume that someone didn't, open your hood and wire a bomb into your engine so that when you turn the key, your car blows up. You assume it's safe. You turn the key by faith. We live by faith all the time. St. Augustine actually wrote a treatise on faith where he talks about this. How would you even prove that your parents are your parents? How do you know scientifically that your parents are actually your parents? St. Augustine said, we don't even know that. And I'm not saying you can't prove it, like Gianna is going to pull out her DNA kit that she keeps in her pocket. We didn't DNA test our parents. That's the point. You didn't run tests to confirm that your mother and father are actually your mother and father. You accepted it your whole life by faith, because that's how we live. We live by faith all the time, because faith is based on probability. Faith is based on it's probably true, and so we accept it. That's faith. Okay. Anyway, criticizing faith, you can't even live without faith. If you think about it, you can't live for 20 minutes without exercising faith in 5 different ways. Just pay attention to what you do and realize that Everything is based on faith. The fact that you press a key on your keyboard and assume that it's going to type the right letter and that your computer isn't going to suddenly change the letter and type a different letter or type a different word, that's faith. You have no way to prove that when you actually press the key, right? You have no way to prove it. We do it by faith. We trust that the T key on my keyboard, every time I press it, I trust that it's going to continue to make T's. It's by faith. I don't know that it's going to do that. I have no way to prove it. So anyway, St. Thomas says sacred doctrine is a science, but it's not a science like arithmetic. It's not a science like geometry. It's a science like music. It's a science that's based on truths that are derived from some higher science. And the higher science is God's knowledge, God is the one actually teaching us the content of divine revelation. Faith that Mr. Michael won't just quit us from the meeting. Yes, that's strong faith. That's very strong, hopeful faith. Yeah. Okay, so that's this article here. Sacred doctrine is a science, and you should understand, make sure you understand the answer to the question is yes. Pay attention, pay attention. I know you're all called to careers in comedy, but just make sure you learn this lesson here. St. Thomas says, yes, sacred doctrine is a science, but he makes a qualification. He says there are two different kinds of sciences. Sacred doctrine is not a science according to the first kind. Sacred doctrine is a science of the second kind. So make sure you don't just learn yes, but that you also learn the qualification that he makes, okay? So that's his answer to that question. Now, he then replies to the objections, as you know. The first objection, if you remember, argued that sciences are drawn from self-evident truths. Sacred doctrine is not drawn from self-evident truths, therefore it's not a science. So he replies to that objection here. He says, the principles of any science are either in themselves self-evident or reducible to the conclusions of a higher science, and such, as we have said, are the principles of sacred doctrine. So he explains that the problem with the first objection is that that first objection assumes that there is only one kind of science, and that's simply false. So the problem with the first objection is that a premise is false, and I want to show you what that means. Let's go back up here. He says, every science proceeds from self-evident principles. His argument, the objection, argued with the proposition that every science proceeds from self-evident principles. St. Thomas says that proposition is false. So the objection to the objection is that that proposition that every science proceeds from self-evident principles, that statement is actually not true. There are actually two different kinds of sciences. So that's how St. Thomas defeats that argument, all right? He shows that that premise is not true. And I taught you this, if you paid attention, in our debate and rhetoric class on Friday. I said, when someone makes an argument, when someone gives a presentation, there are two things that you're looking to do. Either prove that a statement they make is false, or prove that their argument is not conclusive, right? There's two things that you can do to show someone is false. To that first objection, St. Thomas does the first. He shows that one of the statements made is false, all right? So that's how he defeats that first argument. Then for the second argument, he says, individual facts are treated of in sacred doctrine, not because it is concerned with them principally, but they are rather introduced as examples to be followed in our lives. Examples as in moral sciences. And in order to establish the authority of those men through whom the divine revelation has come down to us. So St. Thomas explains that the study of sacred doctrine is not concerned with the details of the life of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It uses them as examples of the general principles that it's teaching us. For example, with the life of Abraham, we learn that the just shall live by faith. We learn that as a general principle. The just shall live by faith. So when we study the life of Abraham, we see examples of how the just live by faith. So Abraham's life is not the principal concern. The details of his life are not the principal concern. The moral principle is the principal concern, and the life of Abraham is simply an example of those general principles. So it is scientific. It does deal with general principles. Okay? So that's it for the second article. We see two false arguments raised. We see St. Thomas introduce an authoritative statement that appears to contradict what's been said. And again, the idea of an authoritative statement depends on the audience. So we can see who St. Thomas's audience is here based on the authority that he quotes. He assumes that we all trust St. Augustine, shows that St. Augustine's statement is contrary to these other things that have been said, then gives his answer to the question, gives his proofs and explanation positively for his answer, and then he goes back and shows us what's wrong with the false arguments. So he does everything that's necessary to establish his answer and prove it and destroy other answers, which is the goal of a disputation. So he gets that all done for us. Sacred doctrine is a science. However, there are two kinds of science. Who can tell me what kind of science is sacred doctrine? Who can answer that? What kind of science is sacred doctrine? That's the challenging question. Yes, we know sacred doctrine is a science. What kind? Very good, George. A science like music. Very good. All right, a science like music. Okay, a science that takes for granted the conclusions of another science, right? And in sacred doctrine, what is the other science? What is the higher science that we take for granted when we learn sacred doctrine? What is the higher science that we take for granted? The science of God. And what does that mean, Lara? What does that mean, the science of God? Isn't theology the science of God? What does it mean that we take for granted the science of God as a higher science? What does that even mean? What does that mean? No. What do we mean by science here? You see, you got to keep definitions the same all the time. What do we mean by science? Science is knowledge. Science is certain knowledge, systematic knowledge. The knowledge or the science that sacred doctrine is based on is God's actual knowledge. It's God's knowledge. God actually possesses the science himself. Just as a mathematician possesses the knowledge of arithmetic, God possesses the knowledge of all things. And sacred doctrine is like music because God teaches this subject to us, and he teaches it from this higher knowledge, which is his actual knowledge. So he's like the mathematician. Okay, that's a little bit of a tricky explanation St. Thomas gives us, but it's obvious. Like, how does God know that the world was created? How does he know that? He knows that because of some higher science. What is that higher science? His own knowledge. He created it. Okay. Now you might say, well, that's no. How would that argument ever work? That someone tells us something is true, and then we just believe it based on what they say they know. Well, we're talking about God again. So no, it would not be reasonable for you to accept something that Joe Schmo says, or that, some random person tells you. That would not be reasonable to accept that by faith. So for example, when Dr. Fauci gets on television and says, trust the science. No, there's no such thing as trusting science. We don't trust science. Right? Science demonstrates things. We trust people who we know have certain knowledge. So if we're talking about the origin of the world, there's only one person who it would be reasonable to trust, and that would be God himself, the creator. He's the only person who could possibly know what took place at creation. So it's reasonable to trust God because reasonably, he's the only person who would know. Okay? So that's that. We wouldn't trust a random person, so that argument is true. We wouldn't trust somebody, but we're not talking about a random person. We're talking about the creator of the world. So it is reasonable to trust the Creator that he knows what took place at the beginning of time. That is reasonable. Faith is reasonable. Unbelief is not reasonable. So anybody who claims to not believe in God or not accept divine revelation because they're reasonable doesn't make any sense, because faith is perfectly reasonable. It's necessary. All right, so that's Article 2, that's Article 2 of question 1. St. Thomas's answer is that sacred doctrine is a science. A universal in this article, a universal would simply be that there are two kinds of sciences, right? That's a universal that he reasons from and proves things from. I think that might be the only one. Maybe this here, there are some sciences which, no, I think just that statement that there are two kinds of sciences, that would be the universal that he answers this question from. So we know that. What authorities does he quote? He quotes St. Augustine. In his contradiction, he quotes St. Augustine. There's no quote of sacred scripture or anything else in here, just one quote. So that's it, a pretty easy article to deal with. All right, so that's the second article. It's 3:52. We have more time, but not time enough to get into a whole separate article. So let's just quickly consider that we looked at two articles so far. The first one was whether any doctrine is necessary other than philosophy. The answer to that question is what? Is there any other doctrine necessary besides philosophy? Yes. Okay, good. The second question is whether sacred doctrine is a science. What's the answer to that question? Whether sacred doctrine is a science, the answer is yes. Is it just a simple yes? Just a simple yes? No, not a simple yes. Why is it not a simple yes? It doesn't matter if you type over each other. You can each type the answer just to show that you understand it, or to test yourself. It's not a simple yes because he makes a qualification that there are two kinds of science. Very good, Joy, very good, Josh. Okay. There are two kinds of sciences, one that's based directly on self-evident truths, and another kind of science that's based on knowledge that's been previously proven. Okay, very good. All right, good. So those are the first two articles so far. The next article we'll take up next time is whether sacred doctrine is one single science or whether a number of sciences is necessary. So we'll get into that. Let's see, anything else interesting here before we leave? Whether it's a practical science, whether it's nobler than other sciences. Whether it's the same as wisdom, that's an interesting question. But there's one down here that I think we should talk about real quick. Here we go. The 8th article is pretty interesting. Whether sacred science is a matter of argument. That means whether or not the principles of sacred science can be argued and proven. That's an interesting topic to get into, whether we can actually persuade someone into believing. Very controversial question. You know, should you argue with your neighbors and you know, spend all your time and energy trying to figure out ways to persuade them that the Christian faith is true? And if your neighbors don't believe the Christian faith, is it because you haven't done enough to convince them yet, and it's your fault? Is it your fault that your neighbors don't believe because you're just lazy, or your arguments are bad, or you're a bad example? That's a good question. Is it a matter of argument? Is it established by disputation? And so on. We can also get into questions about how God actually knows things. Does God learn things by reflecting on them and reasoning through them? Is that how God knows things? How does God actually know the truth? Very interesting questions that'll probably leave you in a fetal position at some point, because they're crippling questions sometimes. Like, for example, if there's a parade and you're at a parade and there's one band marching at the front of the parade and there's another band marching at the back of the parade, does God see the first marching band first and the other marching band last? Is there any first and last in God's mind? Does God reason from beginning to end? Is there anything unknown in God's mind? If there's nothing unknown, then how could there ever be a conclusion in God? So you see, there's all these all these thoughts that need to be worked through. Yeah, they make your head spin. That's what I meant before. But they're important to understand because they become universal principles that we can use to answer questions. Much of the stuff people say to contradict religion or to doubt religion, it's just irrational nonsense. It really doesn't make any sense. St. Thomas describes God in one place as that beyond which nothing better can be imagined. And if you just take a definition like that, God is that beyond which nothing better can be imagined. And then you ask, does God exist? St. Thomas would say, yes, something does exist beyond which nothing better can be imagined. And that is what we call God. So you'll get into these very complex arguments that will make your head spin. But there are answers for these things. So we're going to get into them as we go through this. But anyway, that's all for today. We went through the second article, which is what the goal was. Hopefully that clarifies things. And most importantly, you're just going to become more comfortable with St. Thomas's writing, more comfortable with the Summa. And what my real goal is that you'll start to use it as a reference. You'll start to use it when you've got questions, when you've got an argument that you're wrapped up in, or there's a headline that gets you upset. You don't know what the right thing to think about on this topic is. I'd like to know that you're going to the Summa as a starting place to get information, because you'll very often find the best answers there, and it'll save you from a lot of trouble, especially when you get into college and you're writing essays and stuff. You don't have to pretend you're the first human to live on Earth. You can go check the Summa, you can go check the Catechism, see what's already been said about controversial topics. Most of them have already been solved. Or general concepts have already been established that you need to apply to new circumstances. That's the other challenge we face. But that's all for today. I hope that was helpful. I hope you start using the Summa. Don't forget, there's that one page that I gave you a link for. I'll paste it one more time. It's just resources/Summa. Did I post it? No, I didn't post it. There it is. Resources/summa.txt. You can use that all the time, and get used to it because it's very helpful. It'll make you look smart. Even if you don't know what you're talking about, you can at least get some good answers and impress people. So they don't have to know that you're ignorant. You can go and consult St. Thomas. All right, that's all for today. Have a good day. I'll catch you later this week. Let me know if you have any questions, and we'll keep working. Macrina has a question here. You're all free to go, just so you know. If you don't have any questions, you can split. You're welcome, Jana. Macrina, I'm wondering, in English composition, if I don't have experience with one of the topics we're supposed to write, can I write a fiction? Those topics in composition are just intended to be suggestions to help you get thinking about a topic. You can come up with another topic. Just make sure whatever the topic of the lesson is, like if the lesson is about, like writing an introduction or, using descriptions, just make sure whatever you write about, you focus on that skill for that lesson. Okay. That's what those assignments are for. Can't wait for Friday's class. Why am I missing something? Are we supposed to do something important on Friday, or you just like that Friday class? I'll get nervous thinking I'm forgetting about something. You just like the Friday debate and discussion class? Try to come up with controversial questions and prepare responses to them. If you need some suggestions, I'll give you some. I need to come up with a page where I just constantly list controversial questions. Yeah. All right. So I'll catch you next time. Get your studies done, get assignments done, keep moving forward, get your credit, and let me know if you need any help. All right. God bless everybody. Bye-bye.